The Hundred Years' War between England and France was a turning point in European history, spanning over a century of battles, alliances, and shifting power dynamics. But one innovation stands out as a true game-changer: the introduction of gunpowder. This explosive technology didn't just shift the balance of power, it transformed the way wars were fought and shaped the future of military tactics. Before gunpowder, warfare in medieval Europe relied heavily on traditional forces like infantry, cavalry, and archers. Castles were considered nearly impenetrable strongholds, designed to withstand sieges for months, even years. Armies would lay siege to these fortified structures, hoping to starve out the defenders. Battles were dominated by highly trained knights in heavy armor, and longbowmen, like the famous English archers, played a crucial role. But things were about to change drastically. In the 14th century, gunpowder made its way from China to Europe through trade routes and wars. At first, it was seen as a novelty. Early gunpowder weapons were unreliable, dangerous to their users, and slow to reload. But as engineers and blacksmiths improved the technology, gunpowder became the most destructive force on the battlefield. One of the first major uses of gunpowder in the Hundred Years' War came during the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The English army deployed cannons, clumsy, early versions of the artillery we know today. While these cannons were far from the sophisticated weapons of later centuries, they had a psychological effect that could not be underestimated. Imagine being on the battlefield, used to the clash of swords and arrows, and suddenly hearing the deafening roar of a cannon blast. The French troops were taken by surprise. Cannons may not have been accurate in these early days, but their sheer destructive power was undeniable. They could reduce fortifications that once seemed impregnable to rubble, dramatically changing how sieges were fought. Castles that had once stood firm for years could now be brought down in days or even hours. Before the use of cannons, sieges often lasted for months. Armies would surround a castle or town, cutting off food supplies, waiting for the defenders to surrender out of starvation or desperation. But with cannons, walls could be breached quickly, forcing a surrender or allowing attackers to storm the breach with infantry and cavalry. One significant example of this was the Siege of Harfleur in 1415. Although not as famous as the Battle of Agincourt, which followed soon after, Harfleur demonstrated how cannons could be used effectively in a prolonged siege. King Henry VI's army used cannons to bombard the town's defenses, weakening the walls before launching a full-scale assault. The use of gunpowder artillery forced the defenders to surrender after a month of bombardment, a relatively short time compared to earlier sieges without such technology. As cannons improved over time, they became more portable and powerful, further enhancing their battlefield effectiveness. The advent of siege guns meant that fortifications had to adapt. Soon, medieval castles, once the ultimate defensive structures, were becoming obsolete. Walls had to be made thicker, and new star-shaped forts were designed to better absorb cannon fire. This new era of fortification design was one of the direct consequences of gunpowder. In addition to cannons, gunpowder brought about another major change on the battlefield: the introduction of early firearms. One such weapon was the arquebus, a primitive type of gun. It wasn't the most reliable weapon, slow to reload and prone to misfiring, but it marked a significant shift. No longer could heavily armored knights charge into battle with impunity. A well-placed shot from an arquebus could penetrate even the finest armor, making knights vulnerable for the first time in centuries. This led to a gradual decline in the dominance of cavalry and armored knights. Traditionally, knights had been the elite force on the battlefield, their armor making them nearly invulnerable to swords and arrows. But with the rise of firearms, infantrymen armed with arquebus and other early guns could defeat heavily armored knights, shifting the balance of power away from the nobility toward more common soldiers. The decline of knights and castles symbolized the end of medieval warfare and the beginning of the early modern period. No longer could an army rely on a small group of elite warriors to dominate the battlefield. Battles became more about tactics, formations, and the effective use of firearms and artillery. Gunpowder weapons allowed even common soldiers to wield unprecedented power. One famous example of this shift came during the later stages of the Hundred Years' War, at the Battle of Castillon in 1453. Here, the French used a large number of cannons to defeat the English forces, marking the final major engagement of the war. The French had learned from earlier battles and had refined their use of artillery. This victory symbolized not only the end of the Hundred Years' War but also the rise of gunpowder as the dominant force in European warfare. Gunpowder didn't just change the outcome of individual battles, it changed the course of military history. From the use of cannons to destroy walls to early firearms that could pierce armor, this explosive technology marked the end of the medieval way of war and the beginning of the modern age. The Hundred Years' War was one of the first conflicts where gunpowder played a significant role, setting the stage for centuries of technological advancement in warfare. Today, we can trace the origins of modern artillery and firearms back to this period when gunpowder first exploded onto the battlefield, reshaping the future of combat forever.